Episode 79, June 16th, 1915. With the H.A.C. at Hooge, through terror-stricken fields by H.S. Clapham. Read by Grant Shaw. The writer was a member of the Honourable Artillery Company and took part in the notable action at Hooge near Ypres on June 16th. He was a well-known author of the war period, and no passage is worthier of Mr. Clapham's pen than his description of the mixed fighting which took place on that day, when the H.A.C. so greatly distinguished themselves in a fiercely contested action. A whistle blew. The men in the front line went over the top, and we scrambled out and took their places in the front trench. In front of us was a small field with grass knee-high, split diagonally by an old footpath. On the other side of the field was a belt of trees known as Y wood, in which lay the first Hun trench. In a few minutes flags went up there to show that it had been captured and that the troops were going on. Another whistle, and we ourselves scrambled over the parapet and sprinted across the field. Personally, I was so overweighted that I could only amble, and I remember being intensely amused at the sight of a little chap in front of me who seemed in even worse case than myself. Without thinking much about it, I took the diagonal path as the line of least resistance. When I dropped into the Hun trench, I found it a great place, only 3 feet wide and at least 8 deep, and beautifully made of white sandbags back and front. At that spot there was no sign of any damage by our shells, but a number of dead Huns lay in the bottom. There was a sniper's post just where I fell in, a comfortable little square hole fitted with seats and shelves, bottles of beer, tinned meats, and a fine helmet hanging on a hook. Our first duty was to change the wire, so, after annexing the helmet, I slipped off my pack and, climbing out again, started to move the wire from what was now the rear to the new front of the trench. It was rotten stuff, most of it loose coils, and the only knife rests were not more than a couple of feet high. What there was movable of it we got across without much difficulty, and we had just finished when we were ordered to move down the trench, as our diagonal advance had brought us too far to the right. There was a hedge across the back of the trench, so I scrambled through a hole in it, piled my pack rifle and other things, including the helmet, onto the farther side, and started again on the wire. Hereabouts it was much better stuff, and it took us some time to get across and peg down. We had just got the last knife rest across when I saw a man who was placing sandbags on the parapet from the farther side swivel round, throw his legs into the trench, and collapse into a heap in the bottom. Several others were already lying there, and for the first time I realized that a regular hail of machine gun bullets was sweeping over the trench. I made a dive for my pack, but though I found that my pet helmet had disappeared, quite a string of wounded and masterless men had passed down the back of the hedge while I was working, and one of them must have thought it a good souvenir to take into hospital. We all started work at a feverish pace, digging out the trench and building up some sort of shelter in front. One chap, a very nice kid, was bowled over almost at once with a bullet in the groin, and lay in the trench kicking and shrieking while we worked. The attacking battalions had carried several more trenches, and we were told that 2 at least had been held, but our own orders were to consolidate and hold on to the trench we were in at all costs. One could see very little in front. There was a wide field of grass stretching gently upward to a low mound of earth several hundred yards away. This was the next line. Away on the right front was Bellewaerde Wood and Hooge Chateau, both above us, but the latter was partly hidden by the corner of Y wood. I had just filled a sandbag and placed it on the top of the parapet when I happened to glance down and saw a slight movement in the earth between my feet. I stopped and scraped away the soil with my fingers and found what seemed like palpitating flesh. It proved to be a man's cheek, and a few minutes' work uncovered his head. I poured a little water down his throat and 2 or 3 of us dug out the rest of him. He was undamaged except for his feet and ankles, which were a mass of pulp, and he recovered consciousness as we worked. The first thing he said was in English, "What corps are you?" He was a big man, and told us that he was 45 and had only been a soldier for a fortnight. We dragged him out and laid him under the hedge. There was nothing else we could do for him. He had another drink later, but he must have died in the course of the day. I'm afraid we forgot all about him, but nothing could have lived there until evening. The captain was the next to go. He insisted on standing on the parado, directing operations, and got a bullet in the lungs. He could walk, and 2 men were detailed to take him down to the dressing station. One came back to be killed later in the day, but the other stopped a bullet en route and followed the captain. About 5:30 a.m., the Huns started shelling, and the new communication trench soon became a death trap. A constant stream of wounded who had come down from another trench from the north passed along the rear. The Huns made a target of the 2 traverses, unluckily including our own, from which the communication trench opened, and numbers of the wounded were caught just behind us. The trench itself was soon choked with bodies, and it was as easier and as safe to pass over the open above it. The shelling got worse as the day wore on. They plastered us with crumps, shrapnel, and whiz-bangs. One of the latter took off a sandbag from the top of the parapet and landed it on my head. It nearly broke my neck, and I felt ill for some time after. It was grillingly hot, and the air was full of dust, but although one was parched up, one dared not use much of one's water. One never knew how long it must last. I came off better than most in this respect, for I had taken the precaution of carrying 2 water bottles, knowing that one would never last me. The worst of it was the inaction. Every minute several shells fell within a few yards and covered us with dust, and the smell of the explosives poisoned one's mouth. All one could do was crouch against the parapet and pant for breath, expecting every moment to be one's last. And this went on for hours. One began to long for the shell which would put an end to everything, but in time one's nerves became almost numbed, and one lay like a log until roused. I think it must have been midday when something happened. An alarm was given, and we manned the parapet to see some scores of men retreating at a run from the trench in front. They ran right over us, men of half a dozen battalions, and many dropped on the way. As they passed, something was said of gas, but it appeared that nearly all the officers in the 2 front trenches had been killed or wounded. Someone had raised an alarm of gas, and the men had panicked and run. A lot of the runaways insisted on gathering by the hedge just behind us, in spite of our warnings not to do so, and I saw at least 20 hit by shrapnel within a few yards of us. The brigade major arrived, cursing, and called upon some of our men to advance and reoccupy the trench in front. He led them himself, and they made a very fine dash across. I do not think more than 20 fell, and they reoccupied that trench, and, I believe, the third also, before the Huns realized that they were empty. Soon the runaways began to return. They had been turned back in some cases at the point of the revolver, but when their first panic had been overcome, they came back quite willingly, although they must have lost heavily in the process. They crowded into our trench until there was hardly room to move a limb. It was scorchingly hot, and no one could eat, although I tried to do so. All day long, the longest day I ever spent, we were constantly covered with debris from the shell bursts. Great pieces fell all about us, and, packed like herrings, we crowded in the bottom of the trench. Hardly anything could be done for the wounded. If their wounds were slight, they generally risked a dash to the rear. Every now and then we stood to in expectation of a counter-attack, but none developed. About 6 p.m., the worst moment of the day came. The Huns started to bombard us with a shell which is quite new to us. It sounded like a gigantic firework cracker with 2 distinct explosions. These shells came over just about the parapet in a flood, much more quickly than we could count them. After a quarter of an hour of this sort of thing, there was a sudden crash in the trench, and 10 feet of the parapet, just beyond me, was blown away, and everyone around blinded by the dust. With my first glance I saw what looked like half a dozen bodies mingled with sandbags, and then I smelt gas and realized that these were gas shells. I had my respirator on in a hurry, and most of our men were just as quick. The others were slower and suffered for it. One man was sick all over the sandbags, and another was coughing his heart up. We pulled 4 men out of the debris unharmed. One was unconscious and died of gas later. Another was hopelessly smashed. We all thought that this was the end and almost hoped for it, but luckily the gas shells stopped, and after a quarter of an hour we could take off our respirators. I started in at once to build up the parapet again, for we had been laid open to the world in front. But the gas lingered about the hole for hours, and I had to give up delving in the bottom for a time. As it was, it made me feel very sick. A counterattack actually commenced as soon as the bombardment ceased, and we had to stand to again. My rifle had been broken in 2 pieces, but there were plenty of spare ones lying about now. I tried 4, however, before I could get one to act at all. All were jammed, and that one was very stiff. As we leaned over the parapet, I saw the body of a Hun lying 20 yards out in front. It commenced to writhe and finally sat up. I suppose the gas had caught him. The man standing next to me, a corporal in a county battalion, raised his rifle and before I could stop him, sent a bullet into the body. It was a rotten thing to see, but I suppose it was really a merciful end for the poor chap, better than his own gas at any rate. The men in the front trenches had got it as badly as we had, and if the counter-attack was pressed, it did not seem humanly possible, in the condition we were in, to offer a successful defence. One man kept worrying us all by asking what were we to do if the Huns did us in, whether surrender or run. Fortunately, our own guns started up and apparently caught the Huns massing. The counter-attack then crumbled up. In the midst of it all, someone realised that the big gap in the parapet could not be manned, and 4 of us, including myself, were ordered to lie down behind what was left of the parados and cover the gap with our rifles. It was uncomfortable work, as the gas fumes were still very niffy, and the place was a jumble of dead bodies. We could not stand up to clear them away, and in order to get a place at all, I had to lie across the body of a gigantic Hun. As soon as things quietened down a bit, we had a chance to look around. Since the morning, most of the branches of the trees in the wood had gone, and many of the trunks had become mere splintered poles. Something else had changed also, and for a time I could not make out what it was. Then it suddenly flashed across my mind that the thick hedge at the back of the trench had entirely disappeared. It was right in the path of the storm of gas shells, and they had carried it away. We managed to get some sort of parapet erected in the end. It was more or less bulletproof at any rate. At dusk, some scores of men came back from the front line, wounded or gassed. They had to cross the open at a run or a shamble, but I did not see any hit. Then the brigade major appeared and cheered us by promising a relief that night. It still rained shells, although not so hard as before dusk, and we did not feel capable of standing much more of it. As time wore on, the shelling became more fitful, although it never actually ceased. It was comparatively cool again, and one could drink and even eat a little. My cap had gone in the general smash, and I took another which happened to fit. No relief turned up, and about midnight 2 volunteers were asked for to carry to the dressing station a boy prisoner whose leg was smashed. There was considerable competition for the job, as we were told that the men selected could go on to the rear afterwards. A Fusilier and I were the lucky ones. We managed to manufacture a sort of splint for the boy's leg, and then tied his 2 legs together. The Fusilier got him on his back, and I took his legs. It was a rotten job, as the poor wretch started screaming, and screamed until he fainted. After hoisting him out of the trench, we had to cart him across the open, which was a wilderness of shell holes. To make matters worse, I found I was as weak as a rabbit, and could hardly carry myself. Just as we left the trench, a long line of dark figures passed us. They wore the kilt, and we concluded that they were the expected relief. We managed to get the boy as far as the old front line, which was full of our own wounded awaiting the doctor. There we found a hospital orderly, and he suggested we should leave our burden with him. We were thankful enough to do so, as the dressing station was a full half-mile away. After that, my only thought was to get out of the shell fire as quickly as possible, and I made for the road by the way we had come the night before. The field was dotted with small parties of men who had just been relieved. The ground was lower here, and the stench of gas pervaded everything. 2 small gas shells burst in the air above us, but I was too tired to worry about them. The road, when I reached it, was full of troops, bonnets and caps, kilts and puttees, some alone, some in 2s and 3s, some even in sections or small platoons. These, however, soon lost whatever formation they had in the general rush. No one wanted to stay on the Menin road longer than need be. At one point a tree had fallen across the road, and here there was a regular jam of men struggling past. Just then a shell burst close by, and someone shouted, "Gas!" We tried to pull on our respirators, but we were soon out of the immediate radius. A Scot in front of me was hit by a flying piece of shell. "Gi'e's a Hun, mate!" 2 of us took him by the arms and half carried him until we reached the dressing station at Hellfire Corner. There was a hurried, "Goodbye, Jock, good luck," and we dashed off again down the railway line, stumbling over the sleepers as we went. Everything which added to the weight of the load was thrown away that night. Both road and line was strewn with clips of ammunition, tins of food, and articles of clothing. The Hun shells seemed to follow us. One burst on the right of the line, the next on the left. The last one I saw that day burst 100 yards away as we came out on the main road south of Ypres. Hereabouts, some of the houses were still standing, and in one a light was shining. There was a rush for the door, and in the ruined kitchen we found a pump which still worked. The water was of very doubtful quality, but no one had drunk for hours, and its taste was sweet enough for anyone. When we left there it was quite light. Men were lying about, asleep all over the place. I saw an officer asleep on a pile of sacks just outside a ruined house, and close by him 3 men lay in a ditch. I struggled on by myself, and the further I went, the clearer became the road. I passed a dozen men of an Irish unit who had stopped to eat, and there was a small crowd at a wayside watering place. Single men of all sorts shambled along, swaying from side to side as if drunk or half asleep. A mounted transport man stopped me and offered me a mount, but I couldn't have mounted it if I'd tried, and if I could, I'm sure I should have fallen off at once. We've lost half the battalion and nearly all our officers, including the colonel and the second in command. Those of us who are left look worn and old, and our nerves are in tatters. We wake up with a start, and if a shell bursts a mile away, we jump out of our skins. I'm inclined to curse anything and anybody. I suppose that's nerves too. The next day we had the brigadier round. We were all lying about half asleep at the time, and, with a consideration somewhat unusual in a brass hat, he did not have us paraded. We were congratulated and patted on the back and told that we had done very good work, and that next time we should have a chance on our own. What luck! He wound up by saying that troops that could stand that shelling could not be broken, and that he was afraid that we would have to go back into the trenches almost at once. These chaps can't understand that we're not soldiers, and we don't want to be soldiers, and, though we shall carry on as well as we can, we don't in the least like it, and are not in the least degree pleased at the prospect of a brush with the Hun. What we really like is the rest field after the brush is over. One can have no idea of the blessed peace of it after a bad time. To lie on one's back in the sun, to watch the sunset, to wallow in the dirty washing pool, to get a clean shave again, not to be tired all over, to feel against all expectation that one is still alive, to play a quiet game of poker again, or to try to do in the Crown and Anchor merchant.
Brother Bertie went away to do his bit the other day, with a smile on his lips and his lieutenant lips upon his shoulder, bright and gay. As the train moved out, he said, "Remember me to all the birds," though he wagged his paw and went away to war, shouting out these pathetic